Perfect. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Keller. I am the curriculum developer of online platforms and programs for the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. Joining me this afternoon, we have Alla. Do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself there, Alla?
Yeah, so my name is Alla. I am the Education and Awareness Coordinator for the province of Saskatchewan, and I'm speaking from Regina, Saskatchewan, and I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you today, Alla. The presentation that you're going to be seeing over the next hour and a bit, we've booked about an hour and a half. The reason that we typically like to do this is while the presentation will run about 60 minutes, what we found in the past in doing national webinars is we do have several questions at the end of the presentation that tend to take a longer block of time. So while this presentation will likely run until about the top of the next hour or 10 minutes past, we do have a little bit of extra time at the end to take any questions or concerns people may have. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of the presentation. Now, the reason we developed this workshop is because the spread of misconceptions and myths continue to increase the risk of people experiencing harms or issues related to cannabis use. Therefore, Canna-Facts is designed to base evidence, facts, and understandings with an attempt and an effort to dispel myths and clarify any misconceptions or misunderstandings that people may have about cannabis. One big goal of our program is to promote informed understanding and safe decision-making. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page in our discussions. Now, a little bit about our program, for those of you that have maybe never seen a YCAP presentation before. The first thing about our program is we are cannabis neutral. Alla, what does that mean to be neutral about cannabis?
Yeah, so neutrality is the recognition that cannabis itself holds no inherent moral value or lack of moral value. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not pure, it's not evil. YCAP doesn't seek to demonize those who consume. At the same time, we're not promoting cannabis consumption. So neutrality is really instrumental in making sure that these workshops are a safe space to share all sorts of ideas and that no one is marginalized, no one is judged or ascribed to have or not to have certain values or attributes as a result of their ideas. So in a nutshell, that's what cannabis neutrality is.
I love it. And that really leads us to that second point, is that our presentations are meant to be balanced. We present unbiased information based on research. There are some topics that we do have to take some fairly hardline stances on based on where the research has gone, but this isn't to say that we're trying to glamorize or stigmatize the topic of cannabis. We simply want to present facts, again, to make sure that people have an informed understanding. I often say I'm not trying to sway a person's decision, I'm just trying to inform it so that they can come to their own conclusions based on the research. Now, the third thing that we talk about is harm reduction. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the term, we promote informed decision-making. We understand that cannabis use carries risk. And to say abstinence-only programming for everyone, we understand that that really doesn't work for everyone. If it did, we wouldn't have a percentage of the population that uses cannabis. For that matter, we wouldn't have percentages of the population that use tobacco or alcohol either. So we know that abstinence-only isn't the only option for every single person. Instead, we do promote harm reduction because we understand that some people may choose to use a substance. And so we like to promote skills and tips and strategies to try to reduce the risk of harm coming from a decision to use cannabis. Alla, what are some examples of harm reduction when it comes to cannabis use?
When it comes to cannabis use, some examples of harm reduction can include choosing low potency products, which we'll talk about the importance of that later on. It can include even waiting until you're 25 to consume cannabis. It can include not mixing cannabis with other substances. Yeah, so those are just some of them, but there's a ton that can really be implemented.
You're absolutely right. So without further ado, let's jump right in, shall we? This presentation we've set up to be sort of like a trivia game. I'd almost sort of categorize it like many of the other trivia games that we won't name that you've seen maybe on TV. But essentially what we have is 7 categories. Now, each one of these categories, we're going to choose a category and we're going to walk through each one. And as we do, you're going to see statements presented, common colloquial phrases, some are technical sentences that are either clear facts that we've seen research and evidence support, myths that may require a little bit more sort of clarification, or a little bit more of an idea of a misconception. At first, when we created this workshop, we tried to paint these as sort of being true or false, or myth or fact. But the problem is a lot of the things that we see about cannabis, we don't totally know yet. So there are parts that require more clarification, but even being able to access and understand that idea is still important. That some statements may not be completely true, but they may also not be completely false. And we'll show you how that looks today. But more about the categories. We're going to look at the product itself and whether it's natural, therefore should it be safe. We're going to talk about the Cannabis Acts. We're going to talk about academics and athletics. We're going to talk about mental health. We're going to talk about methods of cannabis consumption, as well as cannabis-impaired driving. And finally, we are also going to discuss risks and harm reduction strategies. Now, if we were to walk through all of these categories, we may find ourselves taking quite a bit of time. The beauty and the versatility of the way we set up this deck is that if we're short on time, we know that we can select specific amounts of topics to make sure we can still be respectful of everyone's time while giving as much information as we possibly can. So, Alla, what I'm going to ask first is that you choose one of the categories, and then I'm going to ask our audience to choose the next category that they want to look at. So what category do you think we should start with today?
Why don't we start with the one right there on the top left corner? If it's natural, isn't it safe?
Not a bad idea. Let's start with category number 1. If it is natural, isn't it safe? Do you want to take the first one here, Alla?
Yeah, sure. So I remember hearing this one a lot, especially when I was younger. If cannabis is a plant, that means it's harmless. Are we going to accept that or challenge it?
And for our audience listening, you can enter your response into the chat panel. Let us know if you accept this statement or if you challenge its validity. What do we think here? I see a couple people saying challenge. I see someone recommending the next category. I like that. What else do we think? Do we accept this one or do we challenge it? Survey says, what's our answer here, Alla?
We're going to challenge it.
We are, and that looks like it's the way our audience is going as well. Do you want to elaborate here?
Yeah, so cannabis is a plant that serves a variety of purposes. That part is true. So its fibers can be used to make a whole bunch of different items, paper, fabric, rope, building materials, and all of these things are typically harmless, right? Cannabis leaves and flowers are also consumed as both a medical herb and in recreation. When it's used medicinally, it's prescribed by a health practitioner, and it might even be beneficial for specific people. Medicinal cannabis tends to have higher levels of a compound called CBD or cannabidiol than THC or tetrahydrocannabinol. So these two, CBD and THC, are the most popular compounds out of hundreds of different compounds in cannabis. Cannabis products may have just THC or just CBD or a combination of both. CBD is the non-psychoactive compound, while THC is the psychoactive compound that's responsible for producing the feeling of euphoria or the feeling of being high. So those of you that challenged the statement might have been thinking specifically of THC in the cannabis plants. THC affects the brain, how the brain works, causing changes to the way we think, feel, and act. And some of the possible short-term effects include confusion, fatigue, trouble with concentration, anxiety, increased heart rate, and some of the long-term effects, including those involved with continuous daily use or weekly use, are listed as well. And those can include a risk of dependency, a risk of heart disease, a risk of stroke, and a negative effect on memory and concentration. Steve, do we want to take questions now? I think, yeah.
I believe if anyone does have any questions, they can definitely pop them into the chat or into the Q&A. I do see a lot of people have put into the Q&A, though, sort of challenging that idea. So I'm just clearing those ones off on the Q&A right now, which is great.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, if anyone's got any questions, they can definitely pop them into the chat panel or into the aforementioned Q&A panel. And we'll definitely get some as we go along. But I couldn't have said it any better. For a lot of people that depict cannabis as sort of being a natural product, often what I say back to them is it's important to understand that many natural products do still carry risks. There are many plants that we're aware of that are natural that still carry risk to the body. These include things like poison ivy, ragweed leading to allergies, hogweed leading to significant lesions and burns. And the other product I tend to compare the most to cannabis when it comes to being natural is tobacco. Tobacco is a natural product, but we know it has a long chronicled list of potential health risks if it is inhaled. So it's really important that we can point out that Cannabis does have a lot of great uses, a lot of industrial uses, a lot of very helpful uses. And there are potential medical applications that we're going to talk about as well a little bit. But that doesn't mean that the product is entirely risk-free. So I think you explained it very, very well. Oh, is the chat panel closed? That is interesting. Shouldn't be. There we go. I set it up there so that the attendees can now chat with hosts and panelists. So I'm glad that someone was able to pop into the Q&A that the chat panel was closed. Not sure why Zoom did that today. Question number 2. The majority of teens and young adults use cannabis. Is this a statement that you would accept and say is true? Or do you challenge this one? What do we think? A lot of people challenging this one. A lot of people challenging this one. Ala, you started in our program about a month ago, right? A month and a half ago?
Yes.
Yeah. When you started, if you had heard someone say that the majority of teens and young adults use cannabis, would you have said that that seemed true, or would you have kind of questioned that one a bit?
I would have definitely said that seemed true. I mean, people talk about it all the time.
And I like that you bring up the idea that a lot of people talk about it. This is a statement that does need to be challenged, because even though cannabis has become a very common topic, and it's something that everyone has really kind of talked about in Canada, especially since legalization, we understand that this is not actually the case. Some people may think that if everyone's trying cannabis, why shouldn't they? And one thing that we like to point out for anyone that's seen previous workshops that we do, we really like to point this out. And often I like to show completely different surveys from the last few years to show that any of them that tracked prevalence of use never once showed a point that teens and young adults reported over 50% past year cannabis use, or past 6 months, or past 3 months, or in the case of the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey, past 30-day cannabis use. And this is important. Because again, if youth overestimate how many of their peers use cannabis, and if they believe everyone is using it, they may be more likely to try it themselves based on what they believe is going on around them. I also like pointing this out to parents and professionals that work with youth, because sometimes people will frame a conversation with youth about cannabis saying, I know it seems like everyone's using. But the issue is, as soon as that statement comes out of a person's mouth, in some situations, that's the only thing that the youth is going to hear, that everyone is using. We like to point out that the reality is, there are a significant amount of people that use. About 1 in 8 teens reported past 30-day use at the end of 2019. About a quarter of adults 20 to 24. And we have seen these numbers change a little bit during the COVID pandemic, although the research being released is still limited and coming out in bits and pieces. But we still never see a majority. Cannabis can be used as a risk-free medicine. Would you accept this statement, or would you challenge its validity? What do we think? We know it can be used medicinally, but is it risk-free? Great one to point out as a challenge. And some people may say, well, isn't that a refrain of what you said the first time with the plant being natural? Not quite. There's a great deal of research ongoing, so a great deal of research has been completed, and a great research still to be done into the medicinal and medical uses of cannabis. And we can talk about what some of those uses are. For instance, here in Canada, we understand that medical cannabis can be prescribed to individuals for actually a various amount of medical purposes. This can include nausea or vomiting caused by significant conditions such as chemotherapy or radiation treatment for cancers or advanced HIV/AIDS. It may also be used for appetite stimulation, as we know that CBD can impact the endocannabinoid system as it binds with CB2 receptors, which can increase feelings of appetite. May also be used to relieve pain, especially chronic pain and inflammation caused by certain chronic illnesses like multiple sclerosis. We have seen research that has shown that CBD-based products may be used to support with epilepsy in youth, although more research is still ongoing there. But what's important to understand is we know THC products are associated with physical and psychological harms. That is true. But we also know that low potency doses of THC may actually be prescribed for support with nausea and vomiting. THC does have a bit of a weird effect in that as the THC potency increases, or as an individual absorbs more THC, we may actually see that it acts less as an antiemetic and actually can cause nausea and vomiting. But even the CBD-based products, those products that are researched for medicinal purposes, they may actually still interfere with certain other medications, products, and supplements. In fact, in 2020, research out of Penn State revealed that there was a significant amount of prescription medications which when mixed with cannabis, may have adverse effects on the body or may limit their efficacies. This included certain heart medications, diabetes medications, thyroid medications, as well as birth control and anti-seizure medications. Some of this had to do with the fact that it may limit the efficacy of the product, but a secondary issue that we saw come up is that many of these products have an impact and effect on blood pressure, and THC and CBD can cause significant changes to blood pressure as well. Mixing these two products together, some research suggested, may actually cause unsafe changes to high or low blood pressure. So what I often like to remind people of is that cannabis is often used for treatment of a symptom or treatment of the way someone is feeling as the result of a condition. It's not necessarily being prescribed as something that cures the condition itself. And if someone is using it for any medicinal purposes, I often recommend that they treat it the way they would any other prescription medication. They speak to a healthcare provider, they speak to their trusted sources, they speak to a counselor or therapist to have these discussions about what's going on in their life so that they can make a little bit more of an informed decision, and certainly look for products that may be a little bit more appropriate for them, while still understanding that that product may not wind up being cannabis itself. Because we still are unable to draw conclusions about the efficacy of medicinal cannabis due to insufficient research and ongoing mixed findings. A perfect example of this is individuals that use cannabis as a sleep aid. While some people will report using cannabis helps them sleep through the night, other people will report that they have insomnia or experience panic or anxiety attacks and can't sleep when they use cannabis. So it's very difficult to draw conclusions one way or the other. The one thing we do know is that pregnant women, children and adolescents, and people with a history of substance use disorders, pre-existing heart disease, or a history of psychosis or schizophrenia should not be treated with cannabis unless advised by a medical professional. So it's very important to understand that there are medical applications, but this needs to be treated like any other medication and discussed and explored as opposed to focusing on self-medication. Ali, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. So the next one is cannabis contains the same amount of THC as it did 40 years ago. Are we going to challenge this one or are we going to accept it? And just put your answers right in the chat. Challenge, yes. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of you are saying challenge, and that is correct. Cannabis definitely does not contain the same amount of THC as it did 40 years ago. If we take a look at this graph, it's kind of astonishing how the potency has just been getting stronger and stronger throughout the years. In 1980, it was an average THC potency in dried leaf cannabis, so the cannabis we find in joints, was 3%, and in 2018, it was 15%, and some studies even show that it's as high as 30%. Yeah, so some strains are really, really strong. The potency of dried flower offered in Ontario cannabis stores can be up to 33%. Cannabis that contains a very low amount of THC, you guys may have heard of hemp, and that's because it has 0.3% THC. So the higher THC, it's what's associated with more risks of cannabis use. And the higher the THC, the more the impact to brain development, mental health, and psychological well-being. People that use more potent products are at a greater risk of experiencing other symptoms like nausea, confusion, paranoia, hallucinations, anxiety, depression, chills, and in serious cases, and especially in those with a history of schizophrenia in their family, psychotic episodes. So there's been just like this gradual shift to stronger potency products over the years. And that's why someone who used cannabis, say 40 years ago and used cannabis today would notice that there's a significant difference in how cannabis affects the body. Yeah, I don't know, Steve, if you have anything to add with regards to that.
I think you summed it up perfectly. I often, whenever I have this discussion, especially with adults, I know we have a lot of treatment providers and researchers on the line here. If you're ever having conversations with adults about cannabis, especially if they have youth involved in their lives, one of the things that I've heard from adults in the past is they talk about their use when they were younger. But it's important to understand that the product has evolved. You mentioned that dried leaf cannabis can be up to or slightly over 33%. But we know that concentrates and extracts can be as high as what, 90, 95, 97%? Is that right?
Yes, and those are getting very popular as well.
Absolutely. And so the comparison I would make would be like saying if someone drank a light beer that was 4% in 1985, to try to tell a youth that alcohol is the same thing as it was 40 years ago would be like saying that they could drink a bottle of Fireball whiskey in 2022 because they're both alcohol. We know that's not the case. And I realize it's a bit of a sort of a humorous or a bit of a ridiculous example, but it's a similar case with THC. That greater amount that's there, the greater the content level, the greater the degree of impairment. Similar to the idea that the greater percentage of alcohol content in a drink, the higher the degree of impairment it can cause. No one has ever died from using cannabis. This is one that I hear from teens when we do presentations. They say, well, I don't see a lot of risk in cannabis. Yeah, maybe there's problems, but they say no one's ever died from using it. Should we accept this statement, or is this one that we challenge? This one's a challenge, and it's a tricky one, because remember how I said at the beginning, there are some statements that we knew we couldn't just say are straight fact or straight myth? This is a statement that does require challenging, and it requires certainly clarification, because cannabis use has been attributed with certain fatalities. In 2017, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine actually released examinations of the health risks of various forms of cannabis. And what they actually found was that cannabis has been associated with significant heart trauma, myocardial infarctions, risk of stroke, and we actually saw that in the Canadian Medical Journal this past September as well. So we do know that there are risks there. Second thing to note is that there are issues with hospitalization. And this is something that may sometimes get discounted by some people, is that individuals can wind up in the hospital from using too much cannabis. This could lead to significant effects such as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is characterized as excessive vomiting, fever, and severe abdominal pain caused by heavy, excessive, and regular cannabis use, particularly with younger users over a period of time. And this isn't vomiting or abdominal pain that, say, lasts for a couple of hours. I've read reports of individuals suffering with CHS that have vomited 20 to 40 times in a day. The only known treatment for CHS that we're aware of at this time is to stop using cannabis until the symptoms go away. But research has suggested that individuals that are affected with this condition that start using cannabis again are more likely to be affected by it a second time or a third, etc. We also know that there are issues with psychotic episodes caused by substances such as cannabis due to their psychoactive effects. These may not be as pronounced and common as previous media depictions in, say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s would say that everyone that used cannabis was going to be affected by this. We know that's not true. But we do understand that there is a small sect of the population which may experience psychotic episodes as a result of use, or worsening or oncoming symptoms of early onset psychosis or schizophrenia as a result of or associated with their use of cannabis. We also know there's a potential for injuries caused by impairment, like slip and fall accidents, impaired driving, and injuries caused by operating machinery. In fact, a report from this past June said that the most common reasons for hospitalization related to cannabis use did have to do with physical injury and physical related harms. And finally, using cannabis can contribute to fatality if a person drives while impaired by cannabis, if they do have a history of pre-existing heart conditions, and finally, if someone mixes cannabis with other drugs. There are certain barbiturates and depressants which research has suggested, if a person mixes cannabis with them, can actually increase the risk of fatal overdose. So it is important to look back on this section and remember that THC we know can cause physical and psychological harms. True, the plant is natural. It's absolutely natural, but there are risks to be considered. And that THC has been increasing in most products over the past 4 decades. We also know that youth are more likely to use cannabis than adults, but that doesn't mean that the majority are using. We also know that cannabis can be prescribed medicinally by a doctor, and that is something that requires consultation and research, but it is not for everyone. And finally, the use of cannabis can result in hospitalization and can, in fact, contribute to fatality. Back to the menu. Loving how on the audience is today. Now, our second category, I did see someone that was asking about the idea of looking at the inhaled and ingested category. Shall we jump over there next, Ella?
Yes, let's do it.
Absolutely. Inhaled and ingested. Let's talk about the methods of cannabis consumption. You want to lead this one on, Ella?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'll start off by just defining what vaping is. Vaping refers to the use of an electronic device with a heating element that, when activated, vaporizes the liquid, so turns the liquid into vapor. so that the user of the device can then inhale the vapor and consume cannabis that way. So vaping is a safe method of inhaling cannabis. Do you want to challenge it or accept it?
See a lot of votes for challenge. Just so the audience knows, there are statements in this presentation that we do have noted as accept. So there's no trick here saying they're all challenged, just so you know in advance.
Yeah, yeah, but safer than smoking, but not safe. Yes, Rosary, I guess yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. So we're going to challenge this one. One difference between vaping cannabis or tobacco versus smoking cigarettes or dried leaf cannabis has to do with how the product is heated, right? So if a person smokes dried leaf cannabis, usually we have to heat it to a very, very high temperature. And so the cannabis plant is being burned at a higher temperature, and that results in a greater amount of toxic chemicals and carcinogens to enter the lungs. Meanwhile, vaporizers or vaping devices, they use electronic heat, and so they heat up the cannabis at a lower temperature, and that results in less carcinogens being released. And so this sort of information kind of forms the basis of the belief that vaping is safer than smoking, just regular smoking. And earlier studies do suggest that vaping is less harmful to the lungs. So Rosary, you're completely right in that early studies do confirm that it's less harmful to the lungs and the respiratory system than cigarette smoking. And that's why vaping has emerged as a popular trend for consuming cannabinoids and nicotine. All right, but just because vapes cannabis doesn't release as many toxic carcinogens into the lungs, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safer, especially when it comes to cannabis, right? So vape pens can release different toxic chemicals into the lungs as well that can be associated with similar lung problems, right? So things like shortness of breath, dry or itchy throat, coughing and wheezing, and also using plastic vape pens, especially from low quality producers or disposable pens that are getting really popular, can cause the plastic to release fumes when heated into the lungs. And in addition to that, the vape juices themselves can contain some more harmful toxins where the long-term effects to the lungs are still unknown. So the research is still very new. While it's believed by consumers that vaping is a healthier alternative to conventional joints, it's been demonstrated that this method is also linked to severe lung and pulmonary illnesses. In addition to that, it's important to kind of recognize that the vape juices themselves contain very high levels of THC. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. They can be stronger than 90% potency, right? And so that includes an increased risk of mental health issues, including dependency for youth. Again, the long-term effects of vape products are still super unknown because it's a new kind of technology and it's getting newer, or it's new, but there's more research every single day. And so, yeah, we'll definitely challenge this statement.
And I love how you explained that. And I also like that you pointed out sort of the changes in physical risk with vaping versus smoking, because that's a lot of where I see the misconception come from in this discussion. It's not to say that it's a total myth to say that vaping is in some ways safer, because there is something there. That idea that there's less carcinogens being inhaled, that is a fair point. But again, I also like that you pointed out the trade-off being that high level of THC does increase the risk of certain mental complications or psychological complications. So it's sort of curious to see what the trade-off is, whether a person's looking more at the physical risk or at the psychological risk. Similar to tobacco, secondhand cannabis smoke is unsafe for the people around them. Sometimes you hear people say that, it's completely different, that it's people smoke tobacco, there's carcinogens there, but there's none in cannabis, right? But do we say that it is in fact unsafe? I see some accepting here. I see, Dana, you also asked if the leaf can be vaped. That is correct. It is possible to vape dried leaf product. And this is actually something that we've heard proposed as a potential harm reduction strategy, is the idea that if an individual is looking at inhaling cannabis products, that they may consider vaping dried leaf so that they're not heating the product up as warm to inhale less carcinogens, and they're not using a vape cartridge, so they're using a lower potent product. And that is certainly one way to look at it. Now, I do see the majority of our audience is saying that they accept the statement they see on the screen. And like I said, there are some that do come up as accept, and you would be correct in this case. We understand that people exposed to secondhand cannabis smoke in an unventilated small room, and I do have to note there's a bit of a difference here. Individuals exposed to secondhand cannabis, you've perhaps heard of the term of hotboxing, people using cannabis, sharing a joint, having a session together in a small space, like a small enclosed room with no windows. Some people may do it in like a van or a small vehicle with the windows up. We have seen that individuals may actually feel some of the effects. They may call it a contact high, right? Research has shown that those individuals may have a small amount of THC actually present in their system, both in blood and urine tests. And in some cases, they may experience some secondhand high, such as mild impairment in motor skills. Now, the research has also shown that if individuals are standing near someone outdoors in a well-ventilated space, the frequency at which those two effects happen tend to be significantly lower. Secondhand tobacco and cannabis smoke do contain similar toxic chemicals. Now, I'm not saying they contain the same amount. We do know that tobacco smoke contains a greater quantity of significant carcinogens such as hydrogen cyanide, benzene, tar, quinoline, and heavy metals. Cannabis smoke does contain them, not to the same frequency, but they do still expose the non-users to the risk of developing lung infections or worsening of symptoms related to lung infections. The secondhand smoking effects apply to vaped cannabis smoke. The research there, from what I have seen, is not quite as clear about it. It's the idea that if an individual's vaping, they're not necessarily passing around sort of that smoke and that THC into the air quite as much, as it's a more concentrated amount, more is getting absorbed into the body. So you may see more of the contact high, but again, as the product being vaped is not necessarily releasing as many of the carcinogens, you may see a lot less of that in the individual being affected by secondhand smoke. So it's a very, very good question. Now, what we do know as well when we look at tobacco smoke in and of itself is that individuals that have a history of lung infections, or children or pregnant women or people living with asthma, bronchitis, COPD, they are at a greater risk of worsening of the symptoms of those specific lung infections. So it is recommended, if an individual is using cannabis, they should do so in an outdoor, well-ventilated space, especially if they're around other individuals who don't use cannabis, simply just to avoid some of these potential risks that we see here. Ella, do you want to ask my favorite question?
Yeah, so the edible that I tried 15 minutes ago isn't working. Should I take some more?
Love this one.
No, someone said no. Yes, no.
I see some votes on challenge here. A lot of votes on challenge here. What do we think, Emma or Hala? Sorry, 15 minutes passed. We're not feeling anything. Is it not working?
No, we have to challenge it because it is still working. The statement is the bane of detox workers. Yes. Yeah, so it's a very common mistake that people tend to make. New and young cannabis users may falsely believe that eating cannabis isn't affecting them because it takes longer for edibles to kick in than smoking or vaping, right? So they'll eat more thinking that the effects will occur quicker if they eat more. The risk here is that not only will they eventually feel impaired from the first serving that they ate, but every serving afterwards will increase their level of impairment, possibly leading to cannabis poisoning due to overconsumption. But we'll talk about that more on the next few slides. Yeah, so we can kind of compare inhaled cannabis products to edible cannabis products to see why this is such a commonly held misperception. With inhaled cannabis products, the effects are felt within seconds or minutes, and this is because inhaled products go through the respiratory system, so it's much, much quicker. Meanwhile, edible cannabis products are felt within 30 minutes up to 4 hours. So it can take even up to 4 hours for people to feel the effects of edible cannabis. And this is because it goes through the digestive system. So it takes longer to digest. And again, this depends, of course, on the person. Different people will feel the effects at different times. Generally, the effects can peak after 10 to 30 minutes for inhaled cannabis, but then for edible cannabis, it takes a lot longer. So effects can take up to 4 hours to peak. And this does not necessarily mean that the edible is not working. It just needs to be processed first in order for the psychoactive chemicals to begin to affect a person. Right. And lastly, research suggests that cannabis impairments by using cannabis edibles can last up to 12 hours, and that is compared to inhaled cannabis products where the effects can last between 6 to 12 hours. Also, with edible cannabis, there's been lots of research that shows that people can feel effects up to even 24 hours after they first use it. So, this waiting period might feel a little bit tedious, but failure to wait may result in consuming more THC, which can cause potential serious psychological and physical effects, things like anxiety, racing heart, panic attacks, vomiting, psychological distress, all sort of symptoms of cannabis overconsumption. And it can last longer if a person consumes edibles rather than inhaling edibles. And it's kind of a little bit, something to be aware of, because edibles are currently the second most common method of cannabis consumption in Canada. And there's a lot of misinformation surrounding edibles. So just to be aware of that and to educate yourself and to consider warning signs it's pretty important. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And even building off that, we have our next statement here. We talked about cannabis smoke potentially being damaging. So sometimes what we've heard from people is, well, edible cannabis doesn't damage the lungs, doesn't harm the lungs. So does that mean it's safe to use then? And it's surprising how often we hear this question from youth, but it's an important one they need to understand. I see a lot of votes coming up on the challenge side of things here. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because again, there's a little sliver of truth in that the edible is not causing harm directly to the lungs because there's not smoke being inhaled and respirated and aspirated that contaminates the lungs. There's truth to that, but we understand that the edible does carry risk in and of itself. And Alla pointed out to a great one a moment ago. The first one we see is the risk of homemade and illicit products containing much higher levels of THC than legally marketed products. Additionally, homemade and illicit products may not be mixed or blended the same way. So while a legally regulated product has to contain the same amount of THC, regardless of where on the product the person's eating or sort of which gummy they choose to eat from a package, a homemade or illicit product may have a mixture at a very different rate. For instance, if someone mixes cannabis brownie mix, and like makes brownie mix at home and mixes in cannabis, they may find that half of their batch only has 10% of the THC, but the other half has 90%. So these can lead to very unpredictable effects. There is an increased risk that we see based on hospital reports, particularly for youth, as reported by Sick Kids this past year, of an increased risk of overconsumption and cannabis poisoning, which can appear as confusion, rapid heartbeat, panic, paranoia, delusions, hallucinations, nausea and vomiting, and may even result in the need for a trip to the hospital. Especially because, again, the product takes longer to take effect. And if people aren't aware of that, they may consume more before they sort of realize how they're feeling. We also see the risk of children and pets consuming edibles. In fact, this past year, I believe it was this past July, edible cannabis products actually account for the most ICU cases of cannabis poisoning for children under 12 here in Ontario, according to Sick Kids. The other thing that we consider is allergic reactions. Many edibles are made with allergens. These include nuts, milk, soy, tree nuts, seafood. And I've seen products take all forms. I've seen cannabis cake pops. I've seen brownies. I saw a cannabis-infused chicken pot pie at a conference this past fall. I've seen people mix cannabis into many different products. So individuals need to consider the importance of waiting a little bit longer with edibles, making sure they designate a driver, keeping these products out of reach of their children and pets, and finally considering the ingredients that they're putting into a mixture. If they're choosing to use or especially sharing with other adults, they need to make sure that they're accommodating for any potential allergies. Ella, you ever heard someone say that holding your breath while smoking cannabis makes the effect stronger?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say this is a true statement? Would you accept this one or would you challenge it?
Well, okay, I'll say that before I started this position, I definitely would have accepted that statement for sure.
It's funny, I would have as well. When I was younger, I heard many people talk about this. You'd see people, they take a long, deep breath from a bong or a joint, they'd hold it, and then they'd cough and it would all come out. What's our audience think? Would you accept this statement or do you challenge this one? This is one that a lot of youth buy into. Challenge, accept. Yeah, I was told it as a youth too. A lot of people thought this one. This one's actually one that needs to be challenged and one that really needs to be understood and clarified. What happens when a person holds their breath while they're smoking? Ella, what's going on when a person holds their breath while smoking?
So basically what's happening is they're depriving their body of oxygen. Their heart rate gets faster, the blood pumps faster, and they feel more lightheaded. And they think that this is just like a stronger hit, and they're just getting more high, but really they're just depriving their bodies of oxygen. Nothing else is really occurring besides that.
You're exactly right. But the one reason we like to bring it up is you think about it, people stand around for 10 minutes, say they're sharing a joint, they're sharing a bong, or they're having one to themselves. If they hold their breath 6, 7, 8, 9 times for 20 seconds, 25 seconds a pop, 10 seconds a pop, they're going to feel pretty dizzy after 10 minutes, and they may falsely attribute that to impairment. The reason that we like to bring it up is that holding breath longer simply allows the toxins and carcinogens in dried leaf product to settle in the lungs, particularly tar. One thing that we've actually seen from research amongst chronic cannabis users versus, say, chronic tobacco users is that in some cases, the cannabis user actually has a greater amount of tar buildup in the lungs than the tobacco user does. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that when a person smokes cigarettes, they inhale, but they exhale fairly naturally. Whereas the person that smokes cannabis, they hold their breath and allow those chemicals, those stickier, more sort of solid chemicals to settle in the lungs. So it's important that individuals understand that the THC is going to be hitting the bloodstream fairly quickly. And if they're inhaling cannabis, it's recommended that they take natural breaths as opposed to long, deep breaths and holding them to reduce some of the physical complications that can occur. So let's review. Edibles take effect slower. In fact, did you know this is the #1 health risk that many people didn't actually know when they were interviewed about the health risks that they learned from legal market products? Is that edibles take effect slower and that their effects can last 2 to 4 times longer, like Ala mentioned. It is possible to use too much cannabis and require medical attention. We alluded to that earlier, but we especially see it with things like edibles. It's recommended that individuals avoid or limit cannabis use of high THC extracts, particularly avoiding or limiting use before the age of 25. We also know that cannabis smoke, including secondhand smoke, can cause damage to the lungs. And further to that topic of the smoke, it is important that the individual does not hold their breath because it's not making them more impaired. It's just making them feel dizzy and sort of have a flush face and maybe feeling a little bit sort of anxious or excitable. It's not caused by impairment. It's caused by a lack of oxygen. Did I miss anything there, Ella?
No, that was great. Summed it up perfectly.
You set it up perfectly. All right, let's ask our audience. We've talked about, is it natural, is it safe? We've talked about inhaled and ingested. Where do we want to go next? What's our audience think?
Got
2
a
people in a
couple
row went for
votes
mental
already.
health.
Yeah.
Shall we jump over to mental health?
Yes.
All right. This is an important one to discuss. And in fact, one of the projects our program is working on right now is a cannabis mental health literacy presentation. And one of our partner agencies with whom we share a community of practice actually has a great resource on mental health literacy that we'll share at the end of the presentation. More on that a little later. Ella, what's our first statement here we want to look at?
Yeah, so youth that use cannabis are more likely to experience issues with dependency than adults. We should probably clarify that when we're talking about dependency, we're alluding to cannabis use disorder. And it's also can be called problematic cannabis use. And so these terms just mean basically that when cannabis use causes negative impacts in everyday life, things like issues with relationships, with school, with work, responsibilities. And the cannabis consumer continues to consume regardless of those consequences. So this statement, youth that use cannabis are more likely to experience issues with dependency than adults, is alluding to cannabis use disorder. Are we going to challenge it or accept it? Yeah, it looks like there's kind of a mix between accepting and challenging. More so for accepting. Yeah.
What is our correct answer here, Ala?
Our correct answer is we're going to accept it. Yeah, so it's true, and the stats really do show it. One risk factor related to cannabis use disorder is the age at which a person begins to use cannabis. Uh, Typically, 1 in 11 people of those who use cannabis develop an addiction to it, right? So that's like 9%. But this statistic rises to about 1 in 6 or 17% for people who start using cannabis as teenagers. And this is really close to almost double the risk. So using when in adolescence does increase the risk. And also 90% of all addictions begin with substance use during adolescence. This sort of risk really does increase when it comes to daily use as well. So using cannabis every day can increase the risk of cannabis use disorder as well. I don't know if I missed anything there, Steve. The risk of addiction goes up to almost up to 50% actually if a person uses cannabis daily. And
no, I think you nailed it all. I don't think there's anything missing there. Cannabis is a gateway drug. We ever heard that statement before? People talk about using cannabis as a gateway drug. It means people are going to move on to using other substances. It's something that's been researched and discussed and hypothesized for decades, really since about 1973. Do we accept this statement or do we challenge it? I always like this one too, because it's a great one to see really like not a divide, but you can see people seeing both sides of this discussion. The research, especially recent research in the last 10 years, actually challenges this statement. So back in the 1970s, it was posited in a research journal, and I believe it was 1973, it might have been 1971, that posited that youth that use cannabis are statistically more likely to move on to using other harder drugs. And this created what was called sort of a gateway drug hypothesis. This belief that if an individual uses a substance, it will increase the chance that they're then going to move on and use other substances. But there's something a little bit conflicting to be shown here. That's an excellent point, Kim. We're actually going to get to discussing psychosis and schizophrenia in just a little while. So I'm really glad that you asked that one. What we'd like to point out here is that statistically speaking, most people that use cannabis don't actually move on to using other substances. If we know that approximately 1 in 5 Canadians over the age of 15 report using cannabis in the past 12 months here in Canada, you would think that the rates of use of other substances would be closer to 1 in 5, or at least even 1 in 10. But we know they're not. In fact, the only substance that we see used more frequently than cannabis is alcohol, a substance which has been legalized for decades longer than cannabis was. The gateway hypothesis overall really hasn't been proven. And specifically, there's no conclusive evidence that cannabis use causally leads to the use of other substances. We see a correlation that if an individual reports using heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, a harder substance, that perhaps they do also report using cannabis. But that correlation doesn't always mean that it caused it. What we do see, however, is that substance use involves more of a complex relationship with other risk factors. And in fact, in one of our other presentations titled Talking with Youth About Cannabis, we talk about risk factors of harm caused by substance use. And I'm going to bring up a few of them here that we see that are particularly indicative or reflective of an increased risk of substance use or polysubstance use. These include a history of trauma, grief, adverse childhood experiences, as well as potentially negative or risky, shall we say, social influences. Those actually tend to be more predicting factors of future substance use than the existing use of substance. And in fact, even the researchers that recorded and documented sort of the idea that cannabis itself is a gateway drug, later on were were mentioning that the survey, the research was actually being funded by anti-cannabis programs, and that the research was actually showing that polysubstance use, cannabis and alcohol, cannabis and tobacco, tobacco and alcohol, was actually more of a predictor of future polysubstance use. Not to say that cannabis was the sole turnkey that moved on to other substances. Next question. Ella, is cannabis proven to treat anxiety?
Okay, so I've heard this one a lot. It's a common response when people ask, why do youth consume cannabis? People respond and say, oh, it's a way to cope with stress and anxiety. So I've heard this one a lot. What does the audience think? Are we going to challenge this or accept it?
I do see them leaning a certain way. Now, while the audience is voting, I do see a question about whether the attendees will receive slides of all this info. I can share the research that we do have from the presentations. And additionally, I am going to be posting the recording of this presentation as well. If you would like a copy of the presentation before I get it posted onto our hub, you can email me anytime at steve.keller@ymcagta.org. And I can send you along the recording before it goes up on our hub, but it should be going up within about a week or two.
Yeah, we have a lot of challenges. Someone said, I do not believe this at all. Short term, it can seem that way. However, anxiety is also a withdrawal symptom, and long term usually actually increases anxiety. That's a great point. Yeah, so most of us are saying challenge. That is completely correct, right? So anxiety in general, so it's a normal feeling, worry, tension, nervousness. People with anxiety will often experience physical symptoms, including an increased heartbeat or sweating. This is a completely normal reaction when it comes to stressful situations. But when we talk about anxiety disorders, that's when anxiety begins to interfere with people's daily functioning, right? And so there's this common sort of misperception that THC can be used to treat anxiety disorders. In reality, there's very limited human trials that exist that can examine how cannabis may impact anxiety. So challenged it, completely correct. It should be challenged because the literature that examines cannabis as a treatment for anxiety disorders is still super young. It's too young to really draw any definitive conclusions. There's some anecdotal evidence in some animal studies that provide a little bit of early support to show that cannabis might be effective for alleviating anxiety. But the results from clinical trials don't really corroborate those findings, and so larger samples are needed. More research is needed, right? So the research is inconclusive. But what do we know? So we know that THC does appear to decrease anxiety at lower doses, right? So when Rosary said short term, it can seem that way, that's completely true, right? So, but at higher doses of THC, pun intended, it can increase anxiety, right? So increased heart rate and racing thoughts, even short term at high doses. That's in contrast with CBD, which can actually, that can be used medicinally if it's prescribed. There have been studies concluding that increased THC can increase the likelihood of experiencing panic attacks and panic disorders. And it's not a one size fits all. So while cannabis appears to help some people with anxiety, it can have the opposite effect for others. Effects of cannabis on anxiety disorders are complex. People with anxiety might be more likely to overindulge in cannabis, which can lead to cannabis use disorders. Again, that includes things like withdrawal symptoms, and long-term actually increases anxiety. Rosary couldn't have said it any better than that. Yeah, so cannabis has been used as kind of a bandage, a short-term self-medication, but this can increase the risk of long-term adverse effects.
One thing I will say, I saw this come up in the Q&A, was someone was asking about pure CBD to lower severe anxiety. I have seen recent studies looking into the potential use of CBD as an anti-anxiety medication. Again, the research is limited, but it has shown some ability to reduce some symptoms associated with anxiety disorders. But again, it's more so treating the symptom more so than the disorder itself. So one thing that we tend to recommend or suggest is if individuals are affected with social anxiety or affected with depression or affected with sort of, and we'll talk a little bit more about depression in a moment, is that they do consider sort of healthy alternative coping strategies. It's similar with many different medications. They may help to treat an underlying symptom or an overlying symptom, but if the underlying condition itself is not sort of being treated in some way, and I'm not saying they always can be, but if it's not being treated in some way and there's a possibility for it to, we do see the increased risk that the individual may turn to using the substance more. And especially if they get their hands on a product with more THC in it, they may actually find their symptoms worsen. So it's a very complex relationship with anxiety. Again, CBD has shown early promising results in trials, but more research is still needed. We talk about stress, we talk about anxiety. What about coping? Is cannabis a safe strategy for coping with stress? You talk about using it to cope. They talk about the idea that, they've had a hard day. They smoke a little bit, they take an edible. And coping strategies are those methods that we know a person uses to deal with stressful situations. This may help a person face a situation and take action and be flexible when it comes to solving the problems that they have. I see some votes here on challenging this one. Challenge. It really comes back to that idea of safe and risk-free methodologies, right? That idea, and this is something that we like to always point out to youth is, again, we're not trying to scare them, but we understand that sometimes the rhetoric has taken them the other direction to believing that these things are completely safe or completely stress-free. This is a statement that does require some challenging. While some people may use cannabis to provide temporary relief to stress, research has shown that it can actually be a cause of stress, not just because increased levels of THC may result in greater amounts of anxiety. But let's take an example of a student who's stressed out at school. Could be a post-secondary student, could be a high school student, could be a young adult in the workplace, could be an adult in the workplace. Maybe they choose to use cannabis to help them overcome or deal or cope with their feelings of stress. If the issues going on at work, the issues going on in school, the issues going on sort of at home aren't improving, the cannabis use may in the short term make them feel better. But in some cases, if we see cannabis use resulting in reduced ability to focus, difficulty with memory, or learning and processing new information, let's say that individual is struggling with classwork or work related to their job, and all of a sudden the cannabis use is actually impairing their ability to do work in the school or the workplace, it may actually make their problems worse. So it's important to consider alternative coping strategies. These include things like self-care. And self-care is something that many people take for granted. And I always point this out to youth when we're having discussions, that there's an importance to be said about healthy diet, about balancing their nutritional plan, about getting a solid amount of hours of sleep at night, whether that's 6 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours, whatever the individual feels they need, to set limits to the use of the substances that they're consuming. The importance of connecting with others. We understand that the past 2 years, connection with other people, especially human connection, has been very difficult due to the ongoing pandemic. But as we see things opening up and as we see an increased ability to be able to connect socially through media platforms and online programs, there is still that ability to reach out and speak with someone, especially when seeking support as needed. Because what really matters is identifying the root cause of the stress itself. Because if that can be achieved, if that can be solved, we see less of a risk that the individual is going to turn to using a substance as a coping mechanism. They may still use, but if they're using with an idea that they can maintain a balanced lifestyle, that they're setting limits, that they're still socializing and maintaining the other variants of their health, that may not be as risky of use as if the individual is choosing to use as a prime coping mechanism to deal with problems in their life. Someone was asking about psychosis and schizophrenia. Ella, do you want to take the next one here?
Sure. So using cannabis as a teen increases the risk of developing psychosis or schizophrenia. Are we going to accept it or challenge it? Yeah, so I see many people are accepting it, and someone challenged it, but let's see. Okay, we're going to accept it. So the risk of developing psychosis and schizophrenia in connection with cannabis use, it increases by starting regular use at an early at an early age, so under the age of 16, and with more frequent use, so 3 or more times a week. And with using THC content over 15%, which, as we've seen in previous slides, very common to have that high potency THC. This risk also definitely increases with a family history of psychotic disorders and also a history of trauma or abuse during childhood. That's not to say that anyone with all of these risk factors will definitely develop psychosis or schizophrenia. It's just that there has been an association between the two. Yeah, so Steve has put this awesome resource in the chat, that there's a great resource. The Schizophrenia Society of Canada developed a website and program called Cannabis and Psychosis, and that examines the link in more detail. I think I'll leave it at that, unless Steve has anything to add.
I think it's one that sums up rather well. This tends to be a field of research that I really like to refer people directly to the Schizophrenia Society and the Cannabis and Psychosis program. They've done a very masterful job of examining this link in greater detail. In fact, much of the research that we discuss here is actually almost verbatim from the work they do. They're a partner and a provider that we like to chat with quite a bit. They have a plethora of research here. I've discussed this with EPI Ontario in the past, early psychosis intervention. This is a complicated topic. It's not as simple as saying that everyone that uses cannabis will develop psychosis and schizophrenia. That idea of reefer madness is really a misconception at best and a myth likely at worst. Because again, if we know that 1 in 5 people report using cannabis, if cannabis was always causing schizophrenia or psychosis, that should mean in theory that approximately 1 in 5 Canadians live with psychosis and schizophrenia. We know that's not true. The link is not a perfect direct linear connection. But we do see an increased risk if the individual has a family history, if they have a history of child abuse or trauma early on in their life, if they're using higher potency products, if they're starting regular use early and are starting regular use more often. How about when someone is in recovery phase of psychosis, speaking of triggering relapse of psychosis and triggering symptoms? Again, this is something that I can only speak to very, very marginally. It's something that our research gets closer to. But as it does, we tend to sort of more so defer to the Cannabis and Psychosis program. In fact, if you're curious as well, Kim, I know you've got some questions about that. I'd be more than happy if you want to send me an email. I can actually refer you over to Kia and Sarah over there. They've got some really wonderful resources, I think, that can speak to that a little bit further. Last question about mental health. Cannabis use is safer than alcohol. This is one that we hear from youth, from young people, from adults all the time. They use cannabis because it's safer than alcohol. Or they say it's not risky like alcohol. They say it's not dangerous like alcohol. This is a complicated subject because it's not as simple as saying, again, this is one of those, we couldn't say myth, we couldn't say fact. But it's a statement that does require challenging. Rosary, I like that. There's an idea that there's trade-off there. There's the idea of moderation, the idea that both carry risk. And I think you've all summed this up by combining those ideas very, very well. I'm not saying that cannabis is as risky as alcohol in every way. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not saying that alcohol is more risky in every field. We know that's not true. We know that cannabis is not, quote, more risky in every field. But we also know that there's not enough evidence to really declare the degree of risk with cannabis, unlike what we've seen with alcohol. We know that alcohol is one of the few substances that damages every major organ in the body. We also know that alcohol is one of the few substances whose withdrawal from years of systemic abuse can actually prove fatal. But we also know that cannabis use itself does carry some significant and unique risks. But the use of either substance can actually impact similar aspects of well-being. Both contain physical harms. In the case of alcohol, it's largely to the throat, the digestive system, the liver. With cannabis, it's the lungs, the brain, and the heart. We see risks with mental health, particularly depression and anxiety and dependency. Both substances are linked to complications with pregnancy. Alcohol has a long chronicled and well-researched study into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, while cannabis use during pregnancy, particularly THC, has been associated with things such as early birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, as well as a decreased ability for emotional regulation and learning skills early in life for infants and toddlers. We also see issues with withdrawal, with behavioral and legal issues. And again, the legal issues for both can be quite similar and almost identical in many cases. The other thing to note is that the combination of these two substances increases their individual risks, particularly physical health risks, impaired driving, and hospitalization. We also know that cannabis and alcohol are the two most common substances cited in hospital stays associated with substance use for youth between the ages of 10 to 24. Cannabis use was reported in approximately 40% of hospital stays at that time, while cannabis use alone was reported in 22% of cases, and alcohol use was reported at 26%. So there's no real easy answer to say that one is worse than the other. It really depends on the individual. It depends on their situation. If there's an individual who's dealing with issues with their liver, with their stomach, their digestive system, chances are alcohol would be a far more dangerous or risky sort of a substance to use. But what if that individual has a history of psychosis or schizophrenia? To say that cannabis would be, quote, safer might be complicating their case even more. So this is a very, very complicated statement. And I always like to point out to youth, it's not as simple as saying one's worse than the other. We can't really say that because everyone's situation is different. So again, we understand research has shown that cannabis is not necessarily a gateway to using other drugs, that everyone's experience with cannabis can be largely different. And I think that really sort of sums up a lot of the things we've discussed about health risks, physical risks, as well as even just the effects of impairment. Effects can be different, and the experiences with stress, with anxiety, with depression can be very different with cannabis person to person. And regardless of a person's reasons for using, if it has to do with any part of their mental health, they should consider healthy alternative coping strategies. Consider avoiding or limiting use if they have a history of mental illness, and understand that cannabis and alcohol each pose risks to both physical and mental health, and mixing both can significantly increase the risks. Now, I see we're at about 10 minutes past the hour. I did mention that we have about the 90-minute block. I know we've been taking a lot of questions during the presentation, which is awesome, but it does lend us that we want to make sure we have time to get through one last topic. Ella, shall we discuss the risks and harm reduction strategies of cannabis?
Yes, that's my favorite one. Let's do that one.
I like this one too. It's kind of a nice way to sort of wrap up a lot of our topics. Do you want to take the first one here?
Yeah, sure. So cannabis is risk-free past age 25. Are we going to challenge it or?
I always like asking this one because when we hear a lot of sort of the harm reduction messaging, we often hear people say, wait till you're 25, wait till you're 25, don't use till you're 25, avoid use till you're 25. But for some people, it actually creates almost like a goal line for them. They say, oh, I'm using when I'm over 25. I'm not experiencing any risk. See a lot of challenging coming up here, Ella. What do you think?
Yeah, that's great. The answer is we should definitely challenge it. So we went over this statistic a little bit earlier about cannabis use disorder, and that there's still a risk of cannabis use disorder despite not starting at a younger age. Like the statistic is still there, that there's still a chance. 1 in 3 who use cannabis can develop a problem with their use. 1 in 11 of those who use cannabis can develop an addiction. And daily cannabis use increases the risk of addiction to 25 to 50%. Have there been any studies that you are aware of that talk about the risk of cannabis use in older adults? Steve, I don't know if you want to address that one.
One of our other partners in the CO in the community of practice that we work with through the SUAP funded programming actually created a really great resource called Active Aging, is the name of the program. If you'd like to shoot me an email again, I'd be happy to connect you with it. The other thing that you can do is if you visit our website, which is ymcagta.org/YCAP, you will also see we kind of have a knowledge hub there that's a collection of resources. If you look at the external links, one of the resources there is the Active Aging document. It talks about sort of the idea of cannabis use, the potential risks, and sort of safer harm reduction strategies for older adults. Because our program has that greater focus on youth, we understand a lot of our research looks at youth, teens, young adults, and adults that work with youth. But we do also understand that seniors are sort of our largest demographic in Canada overall, and it is important to be cognizant of what the research has shown. That being said, Active Aging does have a great resource there. You can access it right from our site. It's available in, I want to say, 16 different languages. And again, if you want, you can shoot me an email and I'd be happy to connect you with it. No problem.
Yeah, and with that being said, the physical health risks are there pretty much across the board. Any age can kind of have the effects or the risks involved with physical health risks, such as lung and heart disease. Mental health risks are, prevalent for pretty much everyone and who uses cannabis or has a cannabis dependency. And people who are pregnant or breastfeeding should try to avoid cannabis because there's problems with child development as the growing fetus can be affected, or the cannabis can kind of be excreted through breast milk and then the growing baby can be affected. Again, also keep in mind things like impaired driving. So regardless of age, you have a driver's license and you drive under the influence of cannabis, there's a risk there as well. The reason why we focus on adolescents is because, again, of the fact that the brain is still developing, but the risks are there across the board, especially with frequent and heavy cannabis use. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Alla, you work in Saskatchewan, correct?
Yes.
So you work in Saskatchewan. This is a really interesting topic. I think I'm going to leave for you to discuss. Do you want to take this next one here?
Yeah. So using cannabis once in a while is completely harmless. Do we want to challenge this or accept it? Yeah, this one's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Challenge. Yeah. So most of us are saying challenge. Yeah, so even though we're a harm reduction, like most things, depends on the situation and the individual. Exactly, very, very true. So any cannabis use does carry risk, right? We're a harm reduction program following a harm reduction model, but harm reduction does not necessarily mean harm removal. Here in Saskatchewan, the sort of attitudes surrounding harm reduction can be a little bit iffy. People aren't very accepting of harm reduction. And as such, when I sort of reach out to people, I really like to focus on the concept of waiting until 25. That in itself is also harm reduction. The only way, though, to actually completely avoid the risks associated with cannabis use is to not use cannabis. And that's just the nature of what it is. Not using cannabis is also harm reduction, right? That being said, people may still choose to use a substance or engage in a behavior, no matter what the risks are or the potential consequences. And if they do, the harm reduction strategies are there and they're designed to lower the chances of negative effects. It's not a guarantee that no harm will emerge, but we like to equip people with the tools necessary so that they can, reduce their harm regardless of where they're at with their cannabis use. Yeah, so for example, if a person just uses cannabis, say on the weekend, or they might not run into problems with regards to school, right? But there's still a risk that perhaps they decide to drive under the influence, and then there's a risk for a collision, right? So the risks can be reduced by considering multiple harm reduction strategies in tandem with one another. And again, yeah, it does depend on the situation and the individual. Yeah, so that's why it's important to just know the risks, accept and acknowledge that there's risks involved, and know the ways to reduce the risks involved with each specific behavior. And no matter what the behavior is, there's always room for harm reduction.
I couldn't agree more. I find that the idea of abstinence-only programming versus harm reduction programming is one that kind of leads to a lot of discussion, and in some cases a little bit of division. But I think you did a really good job of summing up the idea that one is really a function of the other. Choosing not to use, in essence, is still harm reduction, but it's making a choice, and it's understanding that people have agency to do that themselves. And there are many people that will choose to use cannabis, aware of risks, just like alcohol, just like tobacco, just like choosing to gamble. Things carry potential risks, and really being equipped with the strategies to sort of mitigate or lower those risks helps, but at the end of the day, they still have to understand that they're accepting a degree of risk. You can tell if someone has problems with cannabis use. Are there ways to really identify if an individual is maybe struggling with cannabis use? What do we think here? And it's more than just saying, do they smell like they've used cannabis? That doesn't mean someone necessarily has a problem. It just means maybe they used, may not even mean they used. Maybe it means they were around someone that used. Statement I see people accepting. What do we think here? This is really an acceptable statement. It is possible to tell. And there are ways to see. Some may seem somewhat obvious. Others are a little more subtle. We know the problematic cannabis use can impact a person's wellness, their behavior, their emotional state, and psychological wellness. So some of the ways that we see that could include an increase in conflict with family and friends, particularly related to or as a cause of their use of a given substance. We do also see the possibility that individuals may steal or break the law to pay for cannabis. Their use of a substance may cause them to struggle with focusing on other responsibilities, either because they're impaired or they're sort of taking up their time thinking about their substance use. They're using more over time to feel the same effects. They're developing a sense of tolerance. Are they using regularly, daily, or near daily at an early age? Are they struggling physically or psychologically to stop or reduce their use? They may experience more anxiety, mood swings, fever, headaches, nausea. Are they using every day? Are they using as a major or primary form of recreation? Are they spending less time with friends and loved ones or doing other things they enjoy in favor of the substance use? That ties into the losing interest. Are they using while driving or during vigorous or rigorous physical activities? And are they using as a primary mechanism to cope with depression, anxiety, stress, and problems? Now, having one or two of these signs appear individually, briefly, periodically, this does not automatically mean a person is experiencing dependency or addiction. But what we understand is these issues or these signs may often experience or appear as a bit of a net. Say an individual is experiencing conflict with family and friends due to their use. So they begin using a little bit more frequently because they're coping with the stress caused by the conflict that they're experiencing. In essence, they're also spending less time with friends and loved ones. Even if they're saying that it's not the substance use that causes that problem, and they're spending less time with loved ones and they're in conflict with loved ones, it's ultimately the substance use that's at the basis of that. And that doesn't mean that the only solution is for them to stop. That's not what we're saying. But what we understand is that there's support available to help an individual if they're affected by issues with substance use. And cannabis is no exception. Now, I see, Ala, you mentioned the idea of harm reduction, and I saw Cheryl mention the idea of limiting potency, especially with edibles. We know that legal market cannabis products cannot have, cannabis edibles cannot have more than 10 milligrams of THC in the entire package, and that one serving of a cannabis edible, according to the National Institute of Cannabis Health and Education, would come out to about 2.5 milligrams of ingested THC. So definitely that idea of setting a limit is certainly helpful. What if I were to say to you that another way to minimize harm is to reduce or avoid cannabis use when doing things that require focus? Would this be seen as acceptable harm reduction? Or is this one you challenge? And I think this is the last question we have. Oh no, we might have one more. What do we think? Judgment acceptance here. See this one as being a viable method of harm reduction. All right. This certainly would be an example of harm reduction. A few people saying they would accept here. There's many ways you can reduce risks of cannabis-related harms. And we've talked about many of these during the presentation, but we really like to expressly highlight them on this slide. The first one that we talk about is avoiding or limiting the use of cannabis at least until the age of 25. And thank you, Suzanne. We certainly hope you enjoyed it. We've got about 2 or 3 slides left. So for those of you sticking around, certainly glad that you are. If an individual is using cannabis, they plan a safe ride. And that message being based on positive messaging, saying what a person can do, instead of just saying don't drive, it's more helpful to give the individual a strategy they can reach out for. Instead of saying don't use and drive, it's if the individual is using, they designate a driver. If they think cannabis is going to be used, they designate a driver. They call a cab, they call an Uber, they take a bus, they walk if they feel safe doing so, they call a friend, they call a family member. They avoid or limit the use of high THC potency products. Use is generally recommended to be limited to more occasional use as opposed to daily or near daily use. They avoid or limit smoking as a method of use, particularly if they have a history of lung infections. They make sure that they make time to participate in other activities that they enjoy, such as extracurriculars or sports, to keep themselves physically active and engaged. They avoid use in case of pregnancy or if the individual is planning to become pregnant, or if they have a family history of mental health disorders or substance use disorders. They avoid mixing with other substances due to potentially unpredictable effects. And one thing that we didn't touch on a lot in this presentation, but we have it actually in one of the categories we didn't get to today, is the idea of synthetic products. These are not actually cannabis products. They're sort of engineered products designed to mimic the effects of cannabis. They were created before cannabis was legal to try to skirt the definition of legality, and we know they're currently illegal. These products can cause significant harms to the body, including kidney failure, certain other organ failure, reduced blood flow to the heart, seizures, and in serious situations, even fatality. It's recommended that if an individual is choosing to use cannabis, they avoid synthetic cannabinoid products altogether. And our very last question for today. Cannabis support services may be free. We hear about a lot of them all across Canada, but they're only available to the person experiencing the problem. What do we think about this statement? I know we've got some providers on the line today that can certainly speak to this one. Whoop. There we go. Leaned down my keyboard and it bumped me back. What do we think? Can only the individual call if they have a problem, or can you call if someone else does? What do we think here? Because you'll hear this. You'll hear people that say, I know someone that's struggling. Could be a peer, could be a friend, could be a loved one. They say, what can I do? That individual doesn't want to go seek treatment at this point. They're not ready to talk about it. What can I do? Well, we understand that providers are available all across Canada, not just for the individual affected, but the people around them. These services exist in every province, and we like to point out some of the larger provincial ones here on our national presentations. Me being based in Ontario, I often refer to Connex Ontario. Ally, you being based in Saskatchewan, I'm guessing that you tend to focus more on sort of the health line and the 811, is that correct?
Exactly, 811, super easy to remember.
Absolutely. Absolutely, couldn't have said it any better. Now, those free and confidential services, especially if you're working with youth, we also like to include Kids Help Phone in here. Kids Help Phone is a national charity, works for free. Kids can call anytime. Their number is 1-800-668-6868. They offer counseling online. They offer support online, as well as community engagement initiatives through staff and volunteers across Canada. And over half of the calls that actually come into Kids Help Phone, and I know this because one of our staff was actually volunteering for them not too long ago, over half of the calls that come into Kids Help Phone are someone calling because they know someone who's in crisis. And again, if an individual is in crisis, they can actually text the word connect to 686868 to immediately access a crisis service. The post-secondary equivalent or young adult equivalent here in Ontario and the Maritimes is Good to Talk. And I believe the other provinces do have a post-secondary equivalent as well. Now, these services provide provide support, available educational resources, health and wellness programming, upcoming wellness events, outpatient service, as well as residential inpatient treatment in some cases, if the individual requires detoxification services, as well as substance use treatment programs. Now, again, we do like to offer some additional resources here at the end of the presentation, so I'm going to pop them up on the screen. The ones that we always like to talk about are our YCAP website. Again, shameless self-promotion, I apologize. But if an individual is curious and seeing some of the resources that our program has created, or getting connections to some of the other ones that we see, you can find them on the ymcagta.org/YCAP website. If you are a researcher looking to see more of the actual research done in primary documentation into cannabis research, particularly over the last 4 to 5 years, you can also access what's known as the Cannabis Knowledge Exchange Hub. We just put the link in as well. This was created by CAMH, providing stakeholders from various sectors across Canada with credible, evidence-based information. It's actually where we get a lot of our information on the non-medical use of cannabis in particular. And finally, if you are working with youth, if you are curious about discussions about mental health literacy, I mentioned we'd touch on this one at the very end, and I wanted to make sure we didn't miss it. Is the aforementioned Cannabis and Psychosis program actually created a self-guided module course for youth? It's about a 90-minute certificate program called Cannabis and Mental Health, which you can access right on their website, cannabismentalhealth.ca. It's a wonderful resource. We actually require that all of our staff actually take it as part of their training to sort of be aware of this discussion and how it's framed for a younger demographic. So again, just very last wrap up. It's recommended to avoid or limit the use of cannabis before age 25, but there are still risks for adults. We understand that daily use, neglecting responsibilities, and losing interest in other activities can be signs of problematic use. And we do understand, in theory, the most effective method of avoiding risk is to not use. We do understand that. But we're also aware that there are a significant percentage of the population that may choose to use. And that doesn't make them bad that they use. It doesn't morally change who they are. So what we do is we prepare them with harm reduction strategies, like planning a safe ride home, setting limits on consumption, and avoiding using if they have medical conditions, or if they're thinking of using for medical purposes, they speak to a healthcare provider first. And we understand that providers are available across Canada to support youth free of charge. Thank you all very much. I see we're right on the time block for today. We still got about 5 or 6 minutes left. Like I said, we've been taking questions throughout the presentation, but if anyone has any before we wrap up for the day, you are certainly welcome to stay on the line and let us know if you do. Also, if you have a moment, I'm going to be putting in a nice little survey link here. You can feel free to fill it out. It takes all of about 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes. Provide any feedback that you'd like. Let us know if we made sure that we hit all of our targets. And if there's any feedback or anything more you'd like to know, definitely let us know. Do you have anything else you want to add, Ella, before we wrap up?
Yeah, just thank you so much for listening. It was a wonderful audience. So thank you.
It was a very engaged audience. I like
Yeah.
that. So,
They were right pretty much every time. So
I always like when they're on the ball. Always like when they're on the ball. Now I am going to end the recording. So again, thank you all. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.